She was a beautiful young mother who cherished her daughters more than anything.
My mom was very, very active with myself and my sister.
She fought for us no matter what.
So finding romance was the last thing on her mind, until it found her.
She was a shoulder for him to cry on. They had a spark.
My sister was like, hey, I have a new boyfriend and I want y'all to meet him.
She felt like he might have been the one.
But when she goes missing, could he be to blame?
He was away during the time of the murder.
I knew it was something really, really wrong.
A trail of clues leads police to a disturbing crime scene.
There's blood everywhere.
It was horrific. I couldn't breathe.
Life went upside down.
And the unbelievable con that ended up in murder.
It was like, wow, are you serious?
He was supposed to be in prison.
She fought to keep her life from ending.
It gives me chills all these years later.
February 4th, 1995. It's a typical Saturday in Tulsa, a city of 375,000 in the heart of Oklahoma oil country.
Tulsa is, I think, probably one of the jewels of Oklahoma. It's a great city. You have all the arts and entertainment, restaurants, good bars to go to.
Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad when you say that you're from Tulsa because there's a lot of crime that happens here.
I would say it's a safe community, but I would say per capita we have a high homicide rate. I've grappled with it my whole career.
So when local resident Maxine Thomas makes a call to Tulsa police in the middle of the night, they're prepared to spring into action.
Tulsa Police, how can I help you?
Yes, I need to file a missing persons report.
Maxine says her friend Sharonda Clark has disappeared. No one has seen or heard from Sharonda in over 12 hours.
Maxine says the 20-year-old mother of two had failed to pick her children up from daycare earlier that evening.
Sharonda had a 4-year-old daughter and a 1.5-year-old daughter, and they were at the daycare, and she didn't go to pick them up as normal.
She always picks her kids up after work. There's no way she would have left them there without telling anyone.
That day, it just kept getting later and later, and slowly the daycare emptied. It was just myself, my sister, and the workers for the daycare. They were calling, but no one was coming or picking up.
Since Maxine was listed as an emergency contact, she was able to step in for Sharonda's two girls.
Fortunately, she was able to come and get them.
I picked up the girls. We went to Sharonda's to look for her.
We go and knock on the door to see if we could get my mom to answer, but no one answered. That was a really, really big flag for myself at the age of 4.
She's a good mom. She wouldn't just abandon her kids like this.
That wasn't like Sharonda to not communicate.
Always gets her kids.
She never, ever, ever done that.
Sharonda was the type of mother who would stop whatever she was doing to make sure that her kids are okay.
Something must have happened to her. That's the only thing I can think of.
Okay, we're going to send 2 units out to that location.
My mom was very, very active with myself and my sister. She was that parent, so I knew it was something really, really wrong.
They were worried about what could be happening to Sharonda.
For 20-year-old Sharonda Clark, motherhood began at a young age.
She was 14 when she first became a mom.
Of course, my grandparents didn't want her to become a teen parent, but she did. I'm her oldest, and she was her mom's oldest as well. So in a lot of ways, we were a lot alike. Her being brand new to parenting, me being brand new.
She loved her daughter, Yashin. She did. She really did. She stopped school to take care of her baby, and so she did odd jobs until she was old enough to work at a real job. The father was real young, too. He was about 15. So it was hard.
However, Sharonda's friends and family rallied around her to help.
We always kicked in and made sure that she had diapers. We worked together to do the best that she could for her daughter. It takes a village. That's all I can say.
Do you need me to still watch her tomorrow?
Oh, yes, that would be amazing. You know, she loves her Auntie Jamaica.
I love her too.
I know.
In the spring of 1992, Sharonda became pregnant again, this time with her daughter, Majorine.
I was 12 when Majorine was born, and it was just like having another little sister, little sibling.
She loved that little baby, oh my goodness. She was always smiling, always smiling.
Majorine's father was a man from the neighborhood, Travis Wells.
How's she doing?
Good. I think she's about to fall asleep.
My mom and my daddy were crazy. Crazy about each other.
So much so that they decided to tie the knot right after Majorine was born.
She was a young married mom, so she experienced not only being a teenage mom, but she also experienced being a teen wife.
She was still really young, but she made good decisions and strong decisions, and there was nobody that was gonna tell her different.
She loves the family she's built.
But unfortunately, just 1 year into the marriage, it began to crumble.
They just began to grow apart, which could happen in any marriage, especially when you start a marriage so young.
That relationship didn't work out.
They ended up separating when Sharonda was 19 years old.
But Sharonda didn't let such a jarring life change get her down.
Sharonda continued to do whatever it took to provide for her 2 children. She worked multiple jobs. She became a manager of a retail chain.
She, with 2 young children, found her own place. She paid her own bills.
Sharonda was a fighter.
She fought for us no matter what. Do anything for us that she could to try to protect us.
As a single mom, Sharonda's busy life didn't leave much time for romance. But later that same year, she'd find a connection in a place she least expected it.
Hey, you okay?
Initially, Sharonda had met Jermaine at his brother's funeral, and being the caring kind of person that she was a shoulder for him to cry on.
I just can't believe he's gone. It's like it hasn't sunk in yet.
23-year-old Jermaine Cannon welcomed Sharonda's compassionate spirit with open arms.
That's how they started communicating. Just to have somebody to talk to laugh with, because she was so funny. And you know, just to give him a head change.
I bet he's living large up there, though.
Yeah, you're probably right.
Sharonda was a light to everyone who met her, including Jermaine.
Before long, their friendship turned into a romance, a relationship that Sharonda was hopeful would finally be the one.
My sister called up to my parents and was like, hey, I have a new boyfriend and I want y'all to meet him.
She was taking things slowly, but her heart was open.
However, it's been more than 12 hours since anyone has seen or heard from Sharonda, and fears are mounting that something terrible may have happened to her.
Sharonda Clark is missing.
She hadn't picked up her kids from daycare.
That wasn't like Sharonda to not communicate.
All right, thank you.
A missing persons report is filed.
Tulsa police begin their investigation by heading to Sharonda's apartment.
The police basically broke in the door.
Police!
When police got inside, they found overturned furniture, spilled food, and bloody walls, indicating a struggle had took place.
There's blood in the kitchen, there's blood in the living room, there's shoe marks of blood all over.
But nothing could prepare police for what they find when they look into the hallway.
They witness a horrendous scene.
There was so much blood.
She didn't deserve this.
After separating from her husband, Travis Wells, 20-year-old mother of two Sharonda Clark had come out on the other side even stronger.
Sharonda was headed in the right direction.
She was willing to do whatever it takes to provide for her two children.
She made sure that we were always together.
Working, tending to us, maintaining friendships, nothing seemed to stop her.
And when she met 23-year-old Jermaine Cannon at the most unlikely of places, it seemed as if she might get another chance at love.
She wound up finding someone who respected and appreciated and loved her.
But in February of 1995, as Valentine's Day approaches, police have discovered a bloody scene inside Sharonda's apartment.
As police were investigating the scene, they noticed a trail of blood leading into the hallway. And when they followed it, they witnessed an even more grisly scene.
They saw the victim laying on the floor, on her back.
Sharonda Clark was dead.
The responding officers immediately called for backup.
I was on call that specific day and night, and you always know when your pager goes off, we still carried pagers then, that you were ready to go. I mean, it was just expected that you were going to have to get out and see something that you really didn't want to see.
When Detective Fultz arrives on the scene, it's clear he's looking at a homicide.
We started looking at the victim and noticed quite a few stab marks on her body.
Someone stabbed her 3 times in the neck region, which severed her carotid artery, her jugular, and then the final blow was a stab wound to the chest.
Apart from those fatal blows, Sharonda also suffered numerous smaller cuts to her hands and arms.
She had what's called defensive wounds. You can imagine a knife coming down on you and she's got her hand up in the air trying to protect herself.
I certainly believe that she did everything she could to keep her life from ending. She fought, she struggled.
Near Sharonda's body, investigators find what they believe is the murder weapon.
The knife was found fairly close to the body. The handle was broken. It was very bloody.
They bag it up for further examination.
Police find more signs of violence inside Sharonda's bedroom.
They found a trail of blood leading to the bedroom.
In the bedroom, everything was in disarray.
There's blood everywhere and spatter on the walls.
It was apparent from looking at the blood stains and the blood trails that the majority of violence and the stabbing occurred in the bedroom. Our suspect had stabbed the victim numerous times and then dragged her from the bedroom into the hallway.
There's something else in the bedroom that catches investigators' attention.
There was a broken window in the bedroom.
At first glance, it appears to be a robbery. But when police further investigate, they find the window had been broken from the inside.
It looks like the window was broken when Sharonda was struggling against her killer.
Other evidence also runs counter to the robbery theory.
There's no signs of forced entry. Nothing appears to be missing.
It looked like Sharonda had let this person into the house.
Someone that uses a knife when it's up close like this, it's extremely personal. It shows me as an investigator that this person had absolutely no regard but rage toward our victim.
When the tragic news reaches Sharonda's loved ones, they're devastated.
I've seen my dad cry, but not like that. My first thought was, why did this happen? How could this happen to our family?
I couldn't breathe. It was devastating for something like that extreme to happen to somebody that you love so much.
You hear mom's gone, mom's not coming back. Almost immediately, life went upside down.
As the sun comes up over Tulsa, investigators start canvassing the apartment complex for potential witnesses.
Investigators reached out to neighbors to see if they had seen anything.
One woman tells police she was friendly with Sharonda, and the young mother was well-liked among the other residents at the apartment complex.
She got along with everybody. People loved to hang out with her.
But Sharonda's neighbor also says she noticed something unusual on Friday afternoon, the day Sharonda disappeared.
I was coming home from the store earlier, and I saw her outside talking to somebody.
According to the neighbor, the two appeared to be in a heated exchange, some type of argument.
They were really going at it, and I can tell she was pretty upset.
To police, it looks like this person could be Sharonda's killer.
Get away from me!
Thanks to one of Sharonda Clark's neighbors, Tulsa detectives have learned that the mother of two was spotted arguing with an unidentified man on the afternoon before her death.
Did you hear what they were arguing about?
No, they were too far away, but it looked pretty heated.
She didn't know the cause of the argument.
But she was worried about Sharonda, and so later on that night, she gave her a call.
She called about 5:30 p.m.
The phone rang, and then somebody finally answered, but it wasn't Sharonda.
Hello?
It's a man. The neighbor believes it was the same man who was arguing with Sharonda that day.
Hi, may I please speak to Sharonda?
Yeah, Sharonda's not here right now. Give me the phone.
He was telling her that Sharonda was not there, but she could hear Sharonda in the background, and then he ended up hanging up on her. And that was probably the last time anybody heard Sharonda alive.
Detectives are hoping her neighbor can help them identify Sharonda's mysterious male companion.
Investigators asked the neighbor if she could recognize him, if she knew what he looked like, what he was wearing.
But they're out of luck.
I saw them from pretty far away, so I really couldn't get a very good look at him.
All that she could recall was that he was a black man in his 20s.
Thank you for your time, man.
Tracking down this new suspect is now investigators' #1 priority.
Sharonda recently separated from her ex-husband, Travis Wells.
Could he be the person she was arguing with that day?
In cases like this, police usually start their investigation with those closest to the victim or anyone they've recently had a disagreement with.
However, it's soon clear Sharonda and her ex didn't have any bad blood.
They were still on amicable terms, that they had exchanged and arranged visitation for their child.
They both got along with one another and were co-parenting and being able to communicate with each other.
After their separation, Travis hadn't even stayed in Tulsa.
Majorene's dad, he moved to Ohio and didn't come back.
He was away during the time of the murder.
Without Travis Wells as a suspect, detectives are back at square one.
Next, investigators subpoena Sharonda's phone records and her bank records, hoping to find something that will give them a clue to what happened.
As detectives pore over the records, they're looking for anything that might raise a red flag.
They looked through all of her recent communications and transactions, but nothing stood out.
They come up empty.
Forensic testing on the murder weapon also leads to a dead end.
They were hoping to recover some fingerprints from the knife, but there was nothing there.
Less than 24 hours into their murder investigation, detectives are already running out of leads. But when they start reaching out to Sharonda's circle of friends, they finally make some headway.
One of Sharonda's friends tells them that she knows of a man Sharonda had been seeing.
Yeah. She met this guy at the funeral for his brother. His name is Jermaine Cannon.
The two of them really hit it off, and Sharonda seemed happy.
However, Sharonda's romance with Jermaine soon hit a roadblock.
One day, Jermaine was just gone.
She told me he took off. She didn't know where he went or what happened to him.
She kind of felt like he might have been the one. Then he disappeared.
She was devastated. She had opened her heart up to someone. Had she missed something?
However, in January of 1995, Jermaine reappeared.
Out of nowhere, Jermaine landed back on her doorstep. Sharonda was shocked.
Did you miss me?
Jermaine? What are you doing here?
Sharonda was happy to see him.
But she was also hesitant to let Jermaine back into her life.
She couldn't rid her mind of those questions. What happened? Why did he leave?
It's been months, Jermaine. Where have you been?
He said, I had to go out of town to take care of some family stuff. He kind of dodged the question, and then he asked Sharonda if he could stay with her.
Why didn't you just let me know where you were going? You just up and left.
I'm sorry, baby. It all happened so fast, but I'm here now. We can be together again.
I don't think she was really comfortable with it, but she said he could stay. He didn't have any place else to go.
She still wanted to carry on this relationship. She just loved him unconditionally.
But after Jermaine moved in, Sharonda quickly came to regret her decision.
She didn't feel like he was being totally honest with her.
Sharonda was probably pulling away from the relationship, and that's when the aggression started.
Jermaine turned violent.
They were fighting. People were starting to notice bruises on Sharonda.
And as the tensions grew, Sharonda confronted Jermaine over his lies.
What do you want?
I want to know where you've been all these months. And I want the truth this time.
Fine, okay? You really want to know?
She found out that he was escaped from jail.
He was a wanted man.
Police in Tulsa, Oklahoma have been trying to identify the man Sharonda Clark was seen arguing with on the day before her body was found.
A neighbor reported seeing Sharonda having an intense argument outside of her apartment with a young black male.
Now, thanks to one of Sharonda's close friends, police think they know who that man was. 23-year-old Jermaine Cannon.
According to the friend, Jermaine and Sharonda had a tumultuous relationship.
A relationship that became even more turbulent after Sharonda learned the truth about her new beau.
I want to know where you've been all these months. And I want the truth this time.
Fine. You really want to know?
Jermaine had been in prison.
What do you mean prison?
I mean, I got locked up, but then I got away.
On the day that he showed up at her door, he'd escaped. The news just shocked Sharonda.
When she told me that, I knew he was bad news. I told her she needed to get away from him.
Sharonda wholeheartedly agreed.
If she knew what had occurred as far as him being an escapee, I really don't have any doubt that she wouldn't have let him in her apartment.
She knew she couldn't have that around her children.
Now, do you have any recollection of Jermaine?
Here and there, like glimpses of him coming in, not really knowing who he was, you know, being a kid asking, who is this, who's staying over, that kind of thing. So it wasn't like, oh, he had been here for a long time.
In the days before she was killed, friends believe Sharonda had been making plans to remove Jermaine from her apartment and her life for good.
She was preparing to kick him out.
One day, Sharonda called her friend, asking if she could watch her children. because she was worried about them being in the house.
Sharonda had called my mother and told her that I needed to get a hold of her ASAP. So I called her phone, but I didn't get any answer from her. I was a little concerned, but I wasn't really too stressed about it because I wasn't sure exactly what she wanted.
Sharonda made these calls. On the same day, the neighbors saw her arguing with the man outside.
For detectives, the picture of what happened to Sharonda is becoming clearer.
Okay, thank you so much for coming down.
So now detectives are starting to put this puzzle together. They think what the neighbors saw was Sharonda kicking Jermaine out of her apartment.
When detectives run a background check on Jermaine, they're able to confirm much of what Sharonda's friends have told them.
We determined that Mr. Cannon had a history of being violent toward women.
Police came across an incident report involving a woman who claimed that Jermaine had burglarized and assaulted her.
He snuck in through a basement window, and she woke up with his hand over her mouth.
A more recent arrest suggests that Jermaine's pattern of violence has been escalating.
The second woman, a former girlfriend, he ended up getting into an argument with her and tried to kill her by using an iron, a toaster, and a hammer, and left her for dead.
She was very fortunate not to have been killed.
He got prosecuted for an assault and battery with intent to kill and got 15 years.
But Jermaine wasn't behind bars for long.
They quickly learned that he had indeed escaped prison.
It was a medium security type facility where they had some freedom. They weren't locked down all the time.
And for whatever reason, he got it in his head that I've had enough of this being incarcerated.
He stole a bus and made his way to Tulsa.
Now, detectives are more determined than ever to track down Jermaine. But that proves easier said than done.
No one has seen him since the day before Sharonda's disappearance.
However, their luck changes when police receive intel from an unexpected source.
The lead detective gets a call. A woman claims to have information about Sharonda's case.
Yes. Is this the detective who's looking for Jermaine Cannon?
Yes, ma'am.
The caller is Jermaine's mother.
She knew her son was in trouble.
She put the pieces together.
Police in Tulsa, Oklahoma have discovered that just a few weeks before she was killed, Sharonda Clark had been tricked into welcoming an escaped convict into her home.
I was in prison.
Jermaine Cannon stole a truck, ended up in Tulsa, and she was just trying to help him out.
Now investigators are searching for the suspected killer, and they've just received a promising lead on his whereabouts.
Yes, ma'am.
They received a phone call from Jermaine's mother. She tipped them off that he had gone to Flint, Michigan.
So you're saying he's in Flint right now?
Yes, sir.
And how do you know this?
He told me himself.
She tells investigators that Jermaine called her, and it surprised her because she knew he was supposed to be in prison.
Somehow or other, he had gotten out of prison, and he said that he was about to take a bus to Flint.
Why Flint?
That's where his uncle is.
Jermaine also told his mother the police were after him for something he didn't do.
That something was the murder of Sharonda Clark.
Jermaine told his mother that he did get in a fight with Sharonda, but it wasn't what it looked like. He insisted on that.
The family didn't want to believe that Jermaine would do this, but they also understood that it was very likely that he had, given his actions, the fact that he had been staying there, the fact that he had escaped from prison.
I told him to turn himself in, but he wouldn't listen to me.
Okay, thank you.
After speaking with Jermaine's mother, Tulsa detectives immediately reach out to law enforcement in Michigan.
They contacted the Flint Police Department and were arranging to have Jermaine arrested at his uncle's house.
But before they can make their move, investigators receive another surprising phone call.
Jermaine actually called Detective Fultz.
He called me. Pretty unusual for a suspect to voluntarily call, but his family had convinced him that it would be in his best interest.
Jermaine tells investigators he knows what the crime scene looks like. He knows how bad it is, but he wants them to give him a chance to tell his side of the story.
Within hours, Jermaine turns himself over to law enforcement.
Investigators explain to Jermaine that they already know he escaped from prison. They ask him to start from there.
Jermaine says once he made his escape, he headed straight for Sharonda's apartment.
He went to Sharonda because they had a spark before he'd gone to prison.
Look, I needed some place to go where I thought the cops wouldn't find me. And I thought that maybe she would let me stay with her.
Jermaine tells investigators that they quickly hit it off. Things were going good for a while, but eventually they began arguing.
Then she started getting on my case about every little thing, you know, and
He's painting Sharonda as the aggressor in this relationship. He claimed that she was violent and she was intimidating.
Then, on February 3rd, he says the tensions reached a breaking point.
Jermaine tells investigators that he decided to leave, but he was worried about what Sharonda might do to him, and so he wasn't gonna tell her.
Look, I was gonna just slip out, okay? Because, I just didn't need her going off on me again.
But Jermaine says before he could make his exit, Sharonda realized what he was up to.
As he was packing up his things, Sharonda came and questioned him. What are you doing?
I can't do this anymore, Sharonda.
What do you mean?
I can't do this no more.
What can't you do?
This!
So you're leaving?
Yes.
He said I was leaving her and she didn't want me to leave.
And she was really mad and she started physically attacking me.
He says after a while, he had no choice but to fight back.
During the struggle, Jermaine says they shattered Sharonda's bedroom windows.
Jermaine says Sharonda went ballistic, lunging at him with a knife, cutting him. The struggle ensued to get control of it.
In the struggle, the knife hit the floor. They both looked at the knife, and he dove for it.
After tracking their suspect almost 1,000 miles from Tulsa, Oklahoma to Flint, Michigan, homicide detectives have arrested Jermaine Cannon for the murder of his girlfriend, Sharonda Clark.
He showed us that he was a very dangerous man. Here's a guy that can't stay out of custody 22 days before he tries to kill somebody else.
But according to Jermaine, Sharonda was the dangerous one in their relationship.
Jermaine's side of the story was that Sharonda was the aggressor and that he was afraid of Sharonda.
Jermaine tells police that on February 3rd, he and Sharonda got into an argument when he revealed that he was leaving her.
Jermaine says she spiraled out of control.
He said we got in an argument and she pulled a knife on him.
Chill.
He was able to gain control of the knife to protect himself.
He admitted that he killed her, but he said he did it in self-defense.
Jermaine says once he realized what he'd done, he tried to help Sharonda.
Look, I didn't want her to die.
He tries to drag her body to the bathroom to find something to stop the bleeding.
He said I was gonna get her first aid.
But Jermaine could tell that Sharonda was already dead.
I couldn't call the cops because, I was a wanted man.
So what did you do?
I got out of there.
He then bought a bus ticket to Flint, Michigan, and went up and knocked on his uncle's door.
Mr. Cannon did not admit that he was at fault. He blamed the victim for the whole thing, said it was all her fault.
Investigators don't buy a word of it.
It's nothing but a story, because there's nothing in evidence that supports his story.
For one thing, Jermaine doesn't have any of the defensive wounds detectives would expect to see if Sharonda had really attacked him with a knife.
He shows detectives his hand.
Didn't have a scratch on it.
What Jermaine was saying couldn't possibly be true. There was no way that she was the aggressor in this situation.
It was the bloodiest scene I'd ever prosecuted. The amount of blood indicating that she was running, trying to get away from him until she couldn't get away anymore. So there just wasn't anything to support his story.
Investigators charged him with first-degree murder.
When Jermaine's trial begins on March 12, 1996, prosecutors outline what they believe really happened that night.
They say that the argument Sharonda's neighbor witnessed was her confronting him over his lies and abuse.
Sharonda wanted him to leave.
But for Jermaine, that wasn't an option.
If she put him out, he would have nowhere to go.
He knew that things would be only worse for him if he had to go back to prison after escaping.
Instead of packing his bags, Jermaine stood his ground.
You think I'm gonna let you kick me out after everything I went through?
He enjoyed his freedom, and he wasn't gonna let anyone, not even Sharonda, stop him.
Jermaine was enraged and tried to beat Sharonda into submission.
But when that wasn't enough, Jermaine went into the kitchen and grabbed a knife.
Get away. Get away from me. Get away from me.
He then started to chase her through the house.
She's running all over this house trying to save her life. I mean, the sheer terror that she went through.
He stabbed Sharonda in cold blood.
He ended up stabbing her 4 times. It gives me chills all these years later. I'm sure it did the same thing to the jury.
Jermaine's own demeanor in the courtroom does little to help his case.
During the trial, he was sitting there with a smile on his face. And it was like, wow, are you serious?
When I saw him, I was kind of shocked. He had this cocky attitude about him, like, yeah, I'm gonna win. There was no remorse. He didn't care.
It takes the jury just 2 short hours to reach a decision.
The jury found Jermaine Cannon guilty of first-degree murder.
It was tears, like, yes, finally, we were happy and relieved.
The jury sentenced him to death by lethal injection, and ultimately, that sentence was carried out July 20th, 2023.
More than 28 years after her murder, Sharonda's loved ones are present for Jermaine's execution.
So we get in the room first, and you could see him mouthing and talking to his family like, I love you, and thumbs up, and grinning, and I'm just like, I'm instantly irritated because my mom didn't get to do any of this. She didn't get to pick her last meal. She damn sure didn't get to say goodbye to anybody. So it was like a slap in the face. It kind of felt like we were doing a make-a-wish for a death row individual.
Jermaine Cannon had an opportunity to say some last words before they started the execution.
His final words are, I confess with my mouth and believe with my heart that God raised Jesus from the dead. Therefore, I am saved.
I know it hurt my niece, my oldest niece, Yashin, more because he got to live basically a whole nother 30 years, a whole life.
Afterwards, I felt confused. I mean, I was happy that I was there. I was happy that I seen it through. I was happy that I got to support my mom when she couldn't. It was just disappointing. And
there are nights that disappear into memory without leaving a trace, and then there are nights that permanently divide a city's history into a before and an after. In the closing hours of December 29, 2014, while most families across Edmonton, Alberta, were settling into the quiet rhythm between Christmas and New Year's Day, no one could have imagined that an ordinary winter evening was about to become one of the darkest chapters the city had ever known. The streets were blanketed in fresh snow. Porch lights reflected softly across frozen sidewalks. Inside warm homes, televisions flickered, children laughed, and conversations drifted through kitchens where the scent of dinner still lingered. It was a time of year associated with reunion, reflection, and hope for the year ahead. Yet somewhere within that peaceful landscape, another story had already begun unfolding, a story driven not by chance, but by years of unresolved conflict, fear, and escalating domestic violence. When police officers were first dispatched, they had no reason to believe they were stepping into a case that would soon stretch across multiple locations and leave an entire community searching for answers. At first, it appeared to be another emergency call requiring immediate attention. But with every new discovery, the scale of the tragedy grew larger. One address led investigators to another. Another victim led to another family. By sunrise, the horrifying picture had become impossible to ignore. 8 innocent lives had been lost. Among them were grandparents, a mother, young children, relatives, and friends, people connected not by random circumstance but by family bonds that should have represented safety. The person responsible was not a stranger hiding in the shadows or an unknown figure whose identity would take months to uncover. Investigators would quickly determine that the violence originated from within the family itself. That conclusion made the tragedy even more difficult to comprehend. For many people, the case raised an unsettling question. How could a family dispute, something that often remains hidden behind closed doors, escalate into one of the deadliest mass killings in Edmonton's history? What warning signs had existed long before that winter night? Could anyone have predicted what was about to happen? And perhaps the hardest question of all, could it have been prevented? These questions would dominate conversations across Canada in the weeks and months that followed. As detectives reconstructed the timeline, they discovered that the events of December 29 were not isolated acts committed in a sudden burst of anger. The roots of the tragedy stretched back years. Court records, previous police interactions, allegations of threats, financial struggles, and a documented history of domestic violence gradually revealed a pattern that had remained largely invisible to the wider public. What appeared to many as an unimaginable act was, in reality, the devastating conclusion of problems that had been growing for a long time. Cases like this challenge the way society thinks about violence. Popular imagination often focuses on crimes committed by strangers. Those stories dominate headlines because they seem unpredictable. Yet statistics consistently show a different reality. The greatest danger frequently comes from people already known to the victims, family members, intimate partners, or former partners whose relationships have deteriorated into cycles of control, intimidation, and abuse. The Edmonton family murders became a painful reminder of that truth. Behind every official report was a person whose life had extended far beyond the brief descriptions found in newspaper headlines. They were parents who had worked hard to build a future after immigrating to Canada. They were children with birthdays still ahead of them, toys left untouched, and dreams that would never have the chance to grow. They were siblings, friends, neighbors, and loved ones whose absence created a silence impossible to replace. For investigators, the challenge was not simply identifying the person responsible. That part would come relatively quickly. Their responsibility became understanding the complete sequence of events, documenting every decision, every movement, and every piece of evidence so that the truth could be preserved with accuracy and respect. Every timeline had to be verified. Every witness statement had to be examined carefully. Every unanswered question mattered, because behind each answer stood grieving families trying to understand how their lives had changed forever. This documentary is not about sensationalizing violence or glorifying the individual who caused it. Instead, it is an examination of how years of domestic abuse, unresolved conflict, and repeated warning signs culminated in irreversible loss. It is also a story about the people whose lives deserve to be remembered for far more than the way they died. Over the course of this investigation, we will examine the family at the center of the case, the history that preceded the violence, the investigation that unfolded across multiple crime scenes, and the broader questions that emerged afterward. We will follow the evidence as detectives encountered it, separating confirmed facts from speculation, and exploring the difficult realities surrounding domestic violence that too often remain hidden until tragedy forces them into public view. The story begins long before police tape surrounded quiet suburban homes. It begins years earlier, inside relationships that outsiders rarely saw in full, where fear could exist behind ordinary smiles and familiar routines. To understand what happened during those winter hours in December 2014, we must first understand the people whose lives became intertwined long before that night arrived. Because tragedies of this magnitude rarely begin with a single gunshot. More often, they begin with years of silence. The final week of December has a peculiar rhythm in Edmonton. The city slows down as the holiday season reaches its quietest point. Schools are closed, office buildings empty earlier than usual, and families retreat indoors to escape the relentless prairie winter. Snow settles over neighborhoods like a thick white blanket, softening the edges of roads, rooftops, and parks. During the day, the sunlight reflects sharply off the frozen landscape. At night, the streets become remarkably still, interrupted only by the distant hum of passing vehicles and the occasional crunch of boots against packed snow. Edmonton is a city accustomed to long winters. Residents understand that life does not stop simply because temperatures plunge below freezing. Children still play outside in heavy coats. Grocery stores remain busy. Restaurants welcome customers seeking warmth from the cold. For many people, winter is less an obstacle than a routine, another season to navigate together. The neighborhood of Clavaton, located in the northern part of the city, reflected that quiet stability. It was a community of detached homes, young families, retirees, and newcomers working to establish comfortable lives. The streets curved gently around small parks and ponds. Many homes displayed Christmas decorations that remained illuminated long after the holiday itself had passed. Inflatable snowmen leaned slightly under accumulated snow. Strings of colored lights outlined rooftops, casting soft reflections onto icy driveways. To an outsider, nothing about the neighborhood suggested that it would soon become associated with one of the darkest criminal investigations in Alberta's history. The same could be said for Haddow, another residential neighborhood several kilometers away. Like many suburban communities in Edmonton, it was designed for ordinary life. Parents drove children to school. Neighbors greeted each other while clearing snow from sidewalks. Dogs barked from fenced backyards. Daily routines repeated themselves with comforting predictability. These were not places people associated with violent crime. That contrast would later become one of the defining characteristics of the case. The locations themselves appeared almost painfully ordinary. There were no abandoned buildings, isolated cabins, or dangerous districts. Instead, the tragedy unfolded inside homes that looked much like thousands of others across Canada. The people who lived there also appeared ordinary to those who knew them casually. Among Edmonton's diverse population was a vibrant Vietnamese community that had steadily grown over several decades. Many families had immigrated following the Vietnam War, seeking stability, opportunity, and safety. Like immigrant communities everywhere, they carried memories of another country while gradually building new lives in Canada. The process was rarely easy. Parents often worked long hours, sometimes holding multiple jobs simultaneously. Language barriers created challenges. Financial pressures remained constant during the first years after immigration. Yet many families persevered, emphasizing education, hard work, and close family relationships as the foundation for a better future. Community organizations, religious institutions, and family-owned businesses became important gathering places. Weddings, birthdays, Lunar New Year celebrations, and weekend dinners reinforced cultural traditions while helping younger generations maintain connections to their heritage. Family occupied a central place within that culture. Grandparents frequently helped care for grandchildren. Adult siblings remained closely connected even after starting families of their own. Decisions were often made collectively rather than individually. During difficult periods, relatives typically offered emotional and financial support whenever possible. Those strong family bonds could become tremendous sources of resilience. They could also become deeply complicated when conflict entered the picture. In situations involving domestic abuse, victims sometimes found themselves caught between competing responsibilities. They wanted to protect themselves and their children while also preserving family unity. Cultural expectations, financial dependence, fear of retaliation, and concern for relatives could all influence decisions that outsiders might struggle to understand. Researchers who study intimate partner violence have long observed that leaving an abusive relationship is rarely a single event. More often, it is a gradual process marked by repeated attempts to separate, periods of reconciliation, legal disputes, and continuing intimidation. Even after relationships officially end, the danger can persist. Former partners may continue attempting to exert control through threats, harassment, financial pressure, or custody disputes. Law enforcement agencies across North America have repeatedly identified separation as one of the periods carrying elevated risk for victims experiencing domestic violence. Those realities form an important backdrop to understanding the Edmonton case. Long before investigators reconstructed the final hours of December 29, there had already been years of history between the individuals involved. To neighbors, much of that history remained invisible. People often remember seeing familiar cars parked outside, children playing during warmer months, or family members carrying groceries into the house. They remember exchanging polite greetings or brief conversations across driveways. These ordinary interactions create an impression of normality, even when significant problems exist behind closed doors. Domestic violence frequently unfolds in precisely that hidden space. Unlike crimes committed in public, abusive relationships often develop gradually and privately. Friends may notice subtle changes. Relatives may become concerned. Police reports may document isolated incidents. Court records may reveal fragments of ongoing disputes. Yet no single observation fully captures the emotional reality experienced by those living inside the relationship. Only later, after tragedy occurs, do the separate pieces begin forming a recognizable pattern. That pattern would become central to the investigation. As detectives worked backward from the crime scenes, they encountered evidence suggesting that the events of December 2014 were not spontaneous. Instead, they reflected years of escalating tension, broken trust, legal intervention, and repeated allegations of threatening behavior. Each document added another layer to the timeline. Each previous incident raised another difficult question. Could the warning signs have been recognized more clearly? That question continues to influence discussions surrounding domestic violence across Canada today. Authorities increasingly emphasize that threats, stalking behavior, repeated intimidation, and previous assaults should not be viewed as isolated events. Instead, they may represent stages within an escalating pattern that requires coordinated intervention from police, courts, and community support services. The Edmonton case would become one example frequently cited in those broader conversations, not because it was unique, but because it illustrated how devastating the consequences can become when multiple risk factors converge. At the center of those discussions stood a family whose lives had become increasingly complicated long before their names appeared in newspaper headlines. Every homicide investigation begins with a name. Every official report begins with dates, locations, and evidence. But long before those names become part of police files, they belong to families, friends, neighbors, and communities. They belong to people whose lives are measured not by the way they died, but by the countless ordinary moments they lived. That is where this story deserves to pause. Before there were crime scenes spread across Edmonton, there was a family that, like many others, had spent years trying to build a life in Canada. Their story reflected the experiences of many immigrant families, years of work, adaptation, sacrifice, and hope that the next generation would enjoy opportunities that had once seemed out of reach. The family at the center of this tragedy was closely connected. Several generations lived within the same network of relatives, supporting one another through everyday life. Family gatherings, shared meals, birthdays, and holidays helped maintain those connections despite the demands of work and raising children. To neighbors, they appeared much like countless other families living in Edmonton's suburbs. The adults worked hard. The children grew up surrounded by relatives. Grandparents remained involved in family life. Friends came and went through the front door. Nothing from the outside suggested that the family would eventually become the focus of one of Alberta's most devastating criminal investigations. At the center of that family was Thuy Tien, often known simply as Tien. Publicly available information about her personal life is limited, and much of what remains known comes from those who remembered her after the tragedy. She was described as a devoted mother whose life revolved around caring for her son and maintaining close relationships with her extended family. Following the breakdown of her marriage, those family relationships became even more significant. Like many people leaving difficult relationships, rebuilding daily life required practical as well as emotional adjustments. Housing, finances, legal matters, parenting responsibilities, and personal safety all become part of a new routine. For many survivors of domestic abuse, independence is not achieved in a single moment but through countless small decisions made over months and years. Support from relatives often becomes essential. In Tien's case, members of her family remained an important part of that support system. Her parents, Van Dang Trung and Thai Dao Le, represented another generation of immigrants who had invested years building a future for their children. Families who relocate across continents often carry enormous responsibilities. They leave familiar places behind, adapt to new languages and customs, and work to create stability for younger generations. Those efforts are rarely visible from the outside. They are reflected instead in ordinary achievements: a mortgage paid, children educated, grandchildren welcomed into the family. By all accounts, family remained central to their lives. Also living within that close family circle was Ton Ha Trung, Tien's younger sister. Like many siblings, their relationship reflected years of shared experiences that stretched back long before life in Edmonton. Sisters often become confidants, helping each other navigate parenthood, careers, relationships, and everyday challenges. Friends later remembered the importance of those family connections. When difficulties arose, relatives were nearby. When celebrations occurred, they celebrated together. That closeness would ultimately make the consequences of the tragedy even more profound. The youngest victims represented futures that had barely begun. 8-year-old Elvis Lam was a child whose world was still defined by school, family, and childhood routines. Public information about his interests is understandably limited, and preserving that privacy remains important. Like children everywhere, his days likely revolved around learning, friendships, and the small milestones that shape elementary school years. Children measure time differently from adults. A birthday feels impossibly far away. Summer seems endless. A single holiday break can become the highlight of an entire year. Late December is especially exciting for many children in Canada. Schools are closed, gifts from Christmas remain scattered around living rooms, and the anticipation of another new year creates a sense of excitement difficult to describe. For young children, those days are often remembered as moments spent with family. 3-year-old Valentina Nguyen was even younger. At that age, life is experienced almost entirely through the present moment. Every day offers something new to discover. Language develops rapidly. Curiosity expands constantly. Familiar faces provide comfort and security. The loss of very young children always resonates deeply within communities because it represents possibilities that will never have the opportunity to unfold. Entire futures disappear before they can truly begin. Another victim, Viet Nguyen, was a friend of Tien. While relatively little verified information has been made public regarding his personal life, his presence within the household on that evening reflects the interconnected nature of close communities, where friendships often become extensions of family. The final victim outside the primary residence was Cindy Duong. She was killed at a second location several kilometers away, demonstrating that the events of that night extended beyond a single household. Exactly why she became a target was examined during the police investigation, but what remains beyond dispute is that another family, separate from the first, experienced an equally devastating loss. For every victim, there existed a wider circle of people whose lives changed forever. Parents lost children. Children lost parents. Friends lost lifelong companions. Co-workers returned to workplaces where familiar faces would never return. Neighbors looked across quiet streets with entirely different eyes after learning what had occurred only a few houses away. One of the most difficult aspects of tragedies involving domestic violence is the ripple effect they leave behind. The immediate victims are never the only people affected. First responders carry memories of the scenes they encounter. Investigators spend months reconstructing events that cannot be undone. Medical personnel, victim advocates, counselors, teachers, and community volunteers all become part of the long process of helping survivors cope with overwhelming grief. Meanwhile, families are forced to navigate funerals, legal proceedings, media attention, and the impossible task of rebuilding lives after unimaginable loss. For immigrant communities, these challenges may be compounded by cultural expectations, language barriers, and the close-knit nature of family networks. The Edmonton case deeply affected members of the Vietnamese-Canadian community. Many residents recognized the family or knew someone connected to them. Places that had once hosted joyful celebrations instead became gathering points for mourning. Community members organized support for grieving relatives, attended memorial services, and reflected on how such violence could emerge within a family. As investigators continued gathering evidence, public attention naturally focused on questions surrounding the offender, his background, his motives, and the sequence of events. Yet those questions, important as they were, should never eclipse the lives that were lost. Remembering victims solely through the circumstances of their deaths risks reducing entire lifetimes to a single day. Each person carried decades of experiences that never appeared in police reports. Parents who had sacrificed for their children. A mother rebuilding her life. A sister who remained close to her family. Friends who offered support. Children whose futures were still unwritten. Those stories matter because they restore perspective. The investigation that followed would reveal warning signs, legal history, financial difficulties, and years of escalating conflict. Those findings help explain how the tragedy occurred. They do not define the people whose lives were taken. As detectives began assembling the timeline of December 29, 2014, their work would move from understanding who the victims were to reconstructing the sequence of events that forever changed Edmonton. That reconstruction would become one of the most significant homicide investigations in the city's history, not only because of the number of lives lost, but because it forced investigators and the public alike to confront a difficult reality: the gravest threats sometimes emerge not from strangers, but from violence that has been building quietly within a family for years. The final Monday of 2014 began much like countless others in Edmonton. The holiday season was nearing its end, and many families were enjoying the quiet days between Christmas and New Year's Eve. Schools remained closed. Offices operated with reduced staff. Residential neighborhoods moved at a slower pace than usual as people visited relatives, finished holiday shopping, or simply stayed indoors to escape the cold. Weather forecasts described typical late December conditions for northern Alberta. Snow-covered streets and rooftops across the city, while temperatures remained well below freezing. As daylight faded during the late afternoon, families returned home, lights appeared in neighborhood windows, and another winter evening settled over Edmonton. Nothing about those early hours suggested that the city was about to experience one of the largest homicide investigations in its history. Investigators would later determine that the violence unfolded over multiple locations rather than a single scene. That fact complicated the investigation from the outset. Detectives would eventually reconstruct a sequence of movements connecting residences in north and southwest Edmonton before ending in the neighboring community of Fort Saskatchewan. Although the broad outline of events would become clear relatively quickly, establishing the precise timeline required careful examination of physical evidence, witness interviews, phone records, surveillance footage, and forensic analysis. According to the investigation, the first location was a residence in the Clavaton neighborhood in North Edmonton. The home was occupied by members of the Trung family, who had gathered during the holiday period. Such gatherings were not unusual. Like many families, relatives spent time together during the final week of December, sharing meals and enjoying time away from work and school. At some point during the evening, the family's routine was interrupted by the arrival of Fu Lam. Police later concluded that those inside the home knew him. There was no indication that investigators were searching for an unknown offender or attempting to identify a stranger who had entered the residence at random. From the beginning, evidence suggested that this was an act rooted in existing family relationships. Exactly how conversations unfolded inside the home remains unknown. The victims could no longer describe those final moments, and no independent witnesses observed what occurred inside the residence. Investigators therefore relied heavily on forensic evidence to reconstruct the sequence of events. What they found established that multiple members of the same extended family had been killed inside the house. The victims represented 3 generations. Adults who had spent years building their lives in Canada. A mother rebuilding her future. Young children whose lives had only begun. The scale of the loss immediately distinguished the case from most homicide investigations handled by Edmonton police. While investigators continued documenting the first scene, they would soon learn that it was not the only location connected to the unfolding tragedy. Evidence gathered during the investigation indicated that after leaving the residence in Clavaton, Fu Lam traveled to another home in the Haddao neighborhood, several kilometers to the southwest. There, another woman with connections to the family was killed. The second location reinforced investigators' belief that the events had not been random or spontaneous. Instead, they appeared to reflect deliberate movement from one destination to another, expanding the number of victims and increasing the complexity of the investigation. At that stage, authorities faced an urgent challenge. They did not yet know whether additional people remained at risk. Whenever multiple crime scenes emerge within a short period, investigators must determine whether the offender is still actively moving through the community. Patrol officers, detectives, and emergency communications personnel work simultaneously to secure scenes, locate potential witnesses, identify surviving relatives, and assess whether further violence may occur. Time becomes critically important. Every unanswered question carries immediate consequences. Is the suspect still armed? Is another destination planned? Are additional victims in danger? During those first hours, law enforcement personnel worked with limited information. Individual officers arriving at separate scenes could observe only fragments of the overall picture. It would take time before those fragments merged into a complete understanding of what had happened. Meanwhile, families and friends began trying to contact loved ones who unexpectedly stopped answering telephones. Calls went unanswered. Messages remained unread. What initially seemed like ordinary communication delays during the holiday season gradually became causes for growing concern. As detectives compared information from different locations, one conclusion became increasingly likely. The same individual appeared responsible for all of the deaths. That realization fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation. Rather than searching for an unknown offender whose identity remained uncertain, investigators shifted toward locating a specific individual whose connection to the victims had already been established. Police resources were redirected accordingly. Information from previous interactions with law enforcement, court records, and known addresses became increasingly important as officers worked to determine where the suspect might have gone after leaving Edmonton. The search eventually led east toward Fort Saskatchewan, a smaller city located just outside the Edmonton metropolitan area. Investigators learned that Fu Lam had previously worked as a maintenance contractor and had connections to a Vietnamese Chinese restaurant there. Those connections made the location significant. Rather than assuming the suspect had fled the region, investigators examined places where he had personal familiarity. The restaurant would ultimately become the final location associated with the case. During the morning of December 30th, officers entered the building. Inside, they found Fu Lam deceased from what investigators determined to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. With that discovery, the immediate public safety threat came to an end. There would be no arrest. No interrogation. No courtroom testimony from the person responsible. Many questions concerning motive and decision-making would therefore need to be answered through evidence rather than direct explanation. The firearm recovered during the investigation was later identified as a 9mm handgun that had previously been reported stolen years earlier in British Columbia. Its recovery added another dimension to the investigation, prompting inquiries into how the weapon had remained in circulation before ultimately being used in the Edmonton killings. For detectives, however, recovering the firearm represented only one part of a much larger investigative process. Every movement during the previous evening had to be reconstructed. Every victim required identification. Families needed notification. Forensic specialists processed multiple locations simultaneously while homicide investigators coordinated interviews with relatives, neighbors, friends, and anyone who might provide additional context. Because the suspect had died, the investigation shifted toward establishing a complete factual record. That record would later become essential not only for official documentation but also for helping surviving relatives understand, as fully as possible, the sequence of events that had unfolded. In the days that followed, Edmonton residents struggled to reconcile the enormity of what had happened. The neighborhoods involved were places where children played outside during warmer months and neighbors exchanged greetings while shoveling snow in winter. Nothing about those communities matched common assumptions about where mass violence occurs. The tragedy challenged those assumptions. It demonstrated that catastrophic violence can emerge within ordinary homes, hidden behind familiar doors, driven by conflicts that may remain largely invisible to the outside world until it is far too late. Media coverage quickly expanded beyond Alberta. Across Canada, newspapers and broadcasters reported that Edmonton had experienced the deadliest mass killing in its modern history. Yet beyond the headlines, investigators remained focused on the painstaking work that defines every major homicide case. Each room had to be photographed. Each item of evidence catalogued. Each timeline verified. Each statement compared against physical findings. Only by assembling every piece with precision could detectives explain not simply what had happened, but how years of escalating domestic conflict had culminated in a tragedy spanning 3 locations and claiming 8 innocent lives. The investigation was only beginning. Behind the police tape, forensic teams continued their meticulous work, searching for answers hidden in the smallest details. Those details, fingerprints, ballistic evidence, digital records, prior police reports, and witness accounts, would soon reveal that the events of December 29th were not an isolated explosion of violence, but the final chapter of a much longer story. One that investigators would spend months carefully reconstructing. The next phase would take them from the visible devastation of the crime scenes into the quieter, more methodical world of forensic analysis, where every overlooked detail had the potential to answer questions the victims themselves could no longer ask. By the morning of December 30th, 2014, what had initially appeared to be a single homicide investigation had become something far larger. Edmonton Police Service investigators now faced the challenge of processing multiple connected scenes while simultaneously confirming the identities of the victims, notifying family members, and determining whether any immediate threat to the public remained. The first priority was to secure each location. Every entrance and exit was documented. Officers established perimeter control to ensure that potential evidence would not be disturbed by weather, bystanders, or the movement of emergency personnel. During the winter months, environmental conditions present unique challenges for investigators. Fresh snowfall can preserve impressions for a short time, but additional snow, wind, or repeated foot traffic can also destroy valuable evidence. Every movement inside and outside a scene must therefore be carefully controlled. Specialized forensic teams arrived to begin a systematic examination. Their work followed established procedures rather than intuition. Each room was photographed before anything was moved. Evidence markers were placed only after the original condition of the scene had been recorded. Measurements were taken to create accurate diagrams that could later be referenced throughout the investigation. Nothing was considered too minor to document. Objects that appeared ordinary at first glance, a drinking glass, a chair slightly out of place, a mobile phone left on a table, could later help establish timelines or corroborate witness statements. Investigators understand that the significance of an item is not always immediately apparent. It often becomes meaningful only when combined with other evidence collected elsewhere. At the residence in Clavaton, the scale of the tragedy required extensive coordination between homicide detectives, forensic identification specialists, medical investigators, and victim services personnel. The victims were formally identified through established investigative procedures before their families were notified. These notifications are among the most difficult responsibilities carried out by law enforcement. Officers receive specialized training for delivering such news with clarity and compassion, recognizing that the conversation will remain with surviving relatives for the rest of their lives. While those notifications were taking place, investigators began reconstructing the chronology of the previous evening. One of the earliest questions was whether there had been signs of forced entry. According to the investigation, evidence did not support the conclusion that an unknown intruder had broken into the home. That finding was significant because it aligned with the developing understanding that the offender was someone already known to the occupants. This shifted investigative attention toward the history of the relationships involved. Detectives assigned to major crimes rarely examine a homicide in isolation. They seek context. Previous police contacts, court records, protection orders, reports of threats, and documented domestic disputes all become relevant sources of information. In this case, investigators soon found that there had been previous interactions between the suspect and the justice system. Those records did not explain the events of December 29 by themselves. They did, however, provide important background regarding the relationship between the suspect and members of the family. At the second scene in Haddow, investigators followed the same careful process. Although smaller in scale, the location proved equally important. Evidence collected there confirmed that the incidents were connected. The movement between locations established that the investigation could not be understood by examining either residence independently. Detectives instead treated the events as components of a single, continuous timeline. Meanwhile, another investigative team focused on the restaurant in Fort Saskatchewan, where Fu Lam was found deceased. Unlike the residential scenes, this location primarily served to answer different questions. How had the suspect traveled there? Had anyone interacted with him after the earlier events? Was there evidence explaining his decisions during the hours before his death? Investigators documented the scene thoroughly, recovered the firearm, and collected any additional evidence that might help complete the timeline. Ballistics specialists later examined the recovered handgun. The examination included confirming that it matched the evidence collected at the connected crime scenes. Firearms analysis is a highly technical process involving microscopic comparison of marks left on cartridge cases and bullets during firing. These distinctive patterns allow forensic laboratories to determine whether evidence originated from a specific firearm. The investigation also established that the handgun had previously been reported stolen in Surrey, British Columbia, several years earlier. That finding prompted additional inquiries into the weapon's history. Although tracing illegally possessed firearms is often difficult, documenting their movement remains an important aspect of criminal investigations and contributes to broader intelligence concerning firearm trafficking. Digital evidence quickly became another important area of inquiry. Modern homicide investigations extend well beyond physical crime scenes. Detectives routinely analyze mobile phones, call histories, text messages, electronic devices, and available surveillance footage to establish movement and communication patterns. In this case, investigators worked to verify the sequence of events using objective evidence wherever possible. Telephone records helped establish periods of communication and silence. Surveillance footage from roads and nearby businesses assisted in confirming travel between locations. Witness interviews added further context, though investigators remained careful to distinguish verified observations from assumptions or rumors that often emerge following high-profile crimes. As news of the case spread, public attention intensified. Large investigations frequently generate speculation, particularly when they involve multiple victims. Detectives therefore emphasized the importance of relying on confirmed evidence rather than unverified reports circulating through social media or informal conversations. Maintaining investigative integrity was essential. Every conclusion needed to withstand careful scrutiny. Another major component of the investigation involved reviewing the suspect's background. This included previous criminal convictions, documented domestic incidents, financial circumstances, and known associations. Investigators sought not only to establish motive but also to understand whether earlier warning signs had existed. Records indicated previous allegations involving threats directed toward members of the family. While each incident had been addressed within the legal framework available at the time, investigators now examined them collectively, asking whether they reflected an escalating pattern rather than isolated disputes. This broader review extended beyond criminal history. Financial records, employment history, and personal circumstances were also considered. Research into domestic violence consistently demonstrates that no single factor predicts lethal outcomes. Instead, investigators often observe combinations of stressors and behaviors, including prior violence, coercive control, threats, separation, and access to firearms. The Edmonton case would later contribute to continuing discussions about those warning signs and how institutions respond when multiple risk factors emerge simultaneously. Throughout the investigation, detectives remained mindful that their responsibility extended beyond identifying what had happened. They also needed to explain it accurately. Because the suspect had died, there would be no criminal trial where evidence could be presented in open court. The investigative file itself therefore became the primary public record documenting the facts established through forensic examination and witness testimony. By the end of the initial forensic phase, investigators had answered several critical questions. They had established that the deaths across the 3 locations were connected. They had identified the individual responsible. They had recovered the firearm used in the offenses. They had reconstructed the suspect's movements with increasing confidence. Yet significant questions still remained. Why had the violence escalated to this point after years of documented conflict? Were there opportunities for intervention before December 2014? How should previous threats be understood in light of what ultimately occurred? Answering those questions required investigators to move beyond the physical evidence collected at the scenes and examine the years leading up to the tragedy. Interviews with relatives, acquaintances, former colleagues, and officials would gradually reveal a history marked by domestic abuse allegations, financial instability, and repeated warning signs. Those findings would shape not only the final investigative report but also wider conversations in Canada about risk assessment, victim protection, and the prevention of domestic violence. The next stage of the investigation would focus on assembling that larger picture, one that stretched back years before the events of a single winter night. In the days following December 30, 2014, the immediate urgency of securing crime scenes gradually shifted into a different phase of work. The visible chaos of multiple locations gave way to a quieter, more methodical process, one that would unfold over weeks and months rather than hours. For investigators with the Edmonton Police Service, the case had already reached a critical turning point. The identity of the person responsible was no longer in question. The suspect had been located, and the immediate threat to public safety had ended. What remained was something often more complex than locating a perpetrator: understanding the full story behind the violence. This stage of an investigation is less about pursuit and more about reconstruction. Detectives now had to answer questions that could not be solved through physical evidence alone. They needed to understand relationships, patterns of behavior, prior interventions, and whether any point in time existed where the outcome might have been different. The first step was organizing the known timeline. Multiple crime scenes had already been linked through forensic analysis, establishing that the incidents were part of a single sequence of events. However, The reasoning behind that sequence remained unclear. Investigators had to determine what led the suspect from one location to another, and whether those movements followed a deliberate plan or emerged from escalating circumstances. At this stage, interviews became central to the investigation. Family members, friends, and acquaintances were approached for statements. These conversations are often emotionally difficult, not only because of grief, but because they require individuals to revisit past experiences and interactions that may now appear significant in hindsight. One of the challenges investigators faced was separating long-term context from retrospective interpretation. After a tragedy occurs, people often attempt to identify warning signs they may not have recognized at the time. Small arguments, changes in behavior, or isolated incidents can take on new meaning when viewed through the lens of what ultimately happened. Detectives must carefully evaluate these accounts, distinguishing between what was actually observable at the time and what is later reconstructed emotionally. Parallel to these interviews, investigators examined the documented history between the suspect and the victims. Court records and prior police interactions revealed that the relationship had involved previous disputes. These incidents had been handled through the legal system in various forms over the years, including allegations related to threats and domestic conflict. However, none of these records existed in isolation. One of the most difficult aspects of domestic violence cases is that they often unfold in fragmented patterns. Incidents may be reported, addressed, and then followed by periods of apparent calm. From the outside, these cycles can appear to be resolved, even when underlying issues remain unresolved or continue in less visible forms. In this case, investigators noted that earlier interventions had not prevented further escalation over time. That observation did not imply a single point of failure. Instead, it reflected a broader challenge faced by law enforcement and support systems dealing with domestic violence cases, identifying when repeated incidents represent escalating risk rather than isolated disputes. As the investigation progressed, attention also turned to financial and personal pressures in the suspect's life. Records indicated that financial difficulties had been present. Employment history showed periods of instability. Investigators examined whether these factors may have contributed to overall stress within the household dynamic. While such conditions do not explain violent behavior, they are frequently documented in cases involving domestic homicide. The purpose of examining them is not to assign causation, but to understand the broader environment in which the events occurred. Another key area of inquiry involved access to firearms. The weapon used in the incidents had been identified as a 9mm handgun. It was later determined to have been reported stolen several years earlier in British Columbia. That discovery raised additional investigative questions about how the firearm remained in circulation and how it came into the possession of the suspect. Tracing illegal firearms is often a complex process. Unlike legally registered weapons, stolen firearms do not follow clear ownership records. Their movement typically relies on fragmented information gathered from prior theft reports, criminal investigations, and intelligence databases. Investigators documented this aspect of the case carefully, as it would later contribute to broader discussions about firearm control and enforcement. Despite the growing body of evidence, several aspects of the case initially presented investigative limitations. The suspect could not be interviewed. There was no opportunity to obtain direct testimony explaining intent or decision-making. This absence is not uncommon in cases where the accused is deceased, but it places greater weight on indirect evidence. Investigators must rely on forensic findings, documented history, and reconstructed timelines rather than first-hand accounts. As a result, some questions remained partially unresolved. Why did the sequence of events escalate in the way that it did? Was there a specific triggering moment, or was the outcome the result of a longer pattern of behavior reaching a critical point? These questions are often central in domestic violence-related homicides, where escalation can occur over extended periods. To address them, investigators worked closely with specialized units and consulted behavioral analysis resources available within law enforcement systems. The goal was not to assign psychological labeling, but to identify patterns consistent with known risk factors. These included prior threats, documented domestic conflict, and separation-related tensions. In many jurisdictions, such factors are recognized as indicators of increased risk in intimate partner violence cases. However, even with these indicators present, predicting specific outcomes remains extremely difficult. One of the most challenging conclusions investigators faced was that the warning signs, when viewed individually, had not always appeared to point toward an imminent mass casualty event. Instead, they were distributed across time, documented in separate incidents, and addressed through different systems. Only in hindsight did the pattern appear fully visible. This realization would later become an important part of broader public discussion about domestic violence prevention. It highlighted the difficulty of connecting isolated incidents into a coherent risk profile in real time, particularly when those incidents are handled by different agencies or occur years apart. During this phase of the investigation, media attention also intensified. Public reporting focused heavily on the scale of the tragedy and the identity of those involved. However, investigators maintained limited public communication to preserve the integrity of ongoing work and to ensure that family members received accurate information before details were released broadly. Behind the scenes, victim services continued supporting families affected by the events. Grief counseling, logistical assistance, and coordination with community organizations became essential components of the response. For those directly impacted, the investigation was not only a matter of public record but also a deeply personal process of understanding loss. As weeks passed, the investigative file grew increasingly comprehensive. Evidence from multiple sources was combined into a unified timeline. Physical findings, witness statements, digital records, and historical documentation were cross-referenced to ensure accuracy. While many details had been clarified, investigators recognized that the final stage of their work would involve presenting not only a factual account but also a contextual understanding of how such an event could occur within a domestic setting. That responsibility would carry forward into the final phase of the investigation, assembling the complete narrative for public record, and addressing the broader questions the case had raised about domestic violence, prevention, and systemic response. By the time investigators entered the later stages of the case, the central mystery had already shifted. This was no longer an investigation searching for an unknown suspect. The identity of the individual responsible had been established early in the process. What remained unresolved was not who, but how and why in the most complete sense that investigative work allows. The breakthrough in cases of this nature rarely arrives as a single dramatic discovery. Instead, it emerges gradually, through the accumulation of consistent findings across multiple streams of evidence. In this investigation, that convergence began when forensic analysis, digital records, and historical documentation started aligning into a coherent timeline. The first layer of clarity came from the physical evidence collected at each location. Ballistic analysis confirmed that the same firearm was connected to all crime scenes. That finding was crucial, not because it identified the suspect, but because it unified what had initially appeared to be separate incidents into a single sequence of events. Once that connection was established, investigators were able to map movement between locations with greater confidence. The second layer involved digital and communication records. Phone activity data helped establish timing patterns. Gaps in communication, along with confirmed locations from tower data, allowed investigators to narrow down windows of movement. Surveillance footage from residential and commercial areas further supported the reconstructed timeline, showing vehicle travel consistent with the sequence already identified through forensic work. None of these elements alone provided a complete picture, but together, they reduced uncertainty around the chronology of events. The third layer of evidence came from historical records. Prior interactions with law enforcement, documented domestic disputes, and legal filings created a background context that investigators could now place alongside the timeline of December the 29th and 30th. This is often where major homicide investigations reach their most significant interpretive stage, when past incidents are no longer viewed as isolated entries in a file, but as part of a longer behavioral pattern. However, investigators remained cautious. Pattern recognition in domestic violence cases is complex. Not every prior incident predicts escalation to lethal violence. Many cases involve repeated conflict without reaching catastrophic outcomes. The challenge for investigators is to identify when a combination of factors may indicate increased risk, while avoiding assumptions that oversimplify human behavior. In this case, what emerged was not a single decisive warning sign, but a convergence of multiple known risk factors that, in hindsight, formed a more concerning picture. These included prior domestic conflict, documented allegations of threats, financial instability, and the presence of an ongoing relational breakdown between individuals involved. Individually, each factor could be interpreted within a range of possible outcomes. Together, they formed a more serious pattern that would later be examined in broader discussions about domestic violence prevention systems. The investigative breakthrough, however, did not come solely from reconstructing the past. It also came from understanding the final movements of the suspect in the hours after the initial events. The sequence leading to Fort Saskatchewan, and the choice of location there, was examined carefully through both physical evidence and prior association records. Investigators established that the suspect had a known connection to the restaurant where he was later found deceased. That connection provided context for why that location became part of the final timeline. For detectives, this was an important element in completing the narrative arc of the investigation. It explained the endpoint of movement, even if it did not explain intent. At this stage, the absence of direct testimony from the suspect remained a defining limitation of the case. Without an interview or formal statement, investigators could not rely on explanations of motive provided by the individual responsible. Instead, they had to construct a conclusion based entirely on external evidence. This is one of the most challenging aspects of homicide investigations involving deceased suspects. The investigative file becomes both the record of events and the closest approximation of intent that can be established through objective means. To address remaining gaps, investigators conducted additional interviews with family members and individuals familiar with the broader history of the relationships involved. These interviews did not always provide new factual discoveries. However, they helped confirm consistency across previously collected information and reinforced the established timeline. In many cases, corroboration is as important as new evidence, particularly when reconstructing events that span multiple years. As the investigation progressed toward its final compilation phase, a clearer understanding began to emerge. The events of December the 29th and 30th were not treated as isolated moments of violence, but as the culmination of a longer trajectory involving domestic conflict and escalation over time. The investigative focus therefore shifted from establishing sequence to presenting context. One of the key findings emphasized by investigators was that the case demonstrated the difficulty of intervention in domestic violence situations where risk factors are distributed across time and handled through multiple systems. Police interactions, legal proceedings, and personal disputes had occurred at different points in time, but there was no single unified mechanism that connected those events into a predictive framework capable of identifying imminent escalation. This fragmentation is not unique to this case. It reflects a broader structural challenge in addressing domestic violence risk assessment across jurisdictions. As investigators prepared their final report, they also reviewed the role of firearm access in the case. The presence of a stolen firearm added another layer of complexity, raising questions about how illegally obtained weapons circulate over time and how they intersect with domestic violence cases. While the investigative file documented the weapon's origin and recovery, it also highlighted a recurring issue in law enforcement: the difficulty of tracing firearms once they enter illicit circulation. By the end of this phase, investigators had assembled a comprehensive reconstruction of events. They had established a verified timeline. They had confirmed the connections between locations. They had documented the suspect's background and prior interactions with the justice system. They had identified patterns relevant to domestic violence risk factors. And they had compiled forensic, digital, and testimonial evidence into a single investigative record. What remained was not further discovery, but interpretation. The final report would need to present the case not only as a sequence of events, but as an example of how domestic conflict, when combined with multiple risk factors and unresolved escalation, can result in catastrophic outcomes. That report would form the basis for public understanding of the case, and would later contribute to broader discussions in Canada about domestic violence prevention, risk assessment, and systemic coordination between law enforcement and social services. The investigation was approaching its conclusion, but the questions it raised were only beginning to be fully understood. In most homicide cases, the justice system follows a familiar structure. Evidence is presented in court, witnesses testify under oath, and a verdict is reached through legal proceedings designed to determine guilt or innocence. The courtroom becomes the central stage where facts are tested, challenged, and ultimately decided. But in some rare and difficult cases, that process never takes place in its traditional form. The Edmonton investigation into the December 2014 killings was one of those cases. With the death of the individual identified as responsible, the legal pathway shifted away from prosecution. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, and no formal judgment delivered by a jury. Instead, the responsibility of establishing a complete and accurate record fell entirely to the investigative file compiled by law enforcement. In practical terms, this meant that the concept of justice in this case took on a different meaning. It was no longer about determining legal guilt in court. It became about ensuring that every fact, every verified detail, and every conclusion supported by evidence was properly documented for the public record and for the families affected. The Edmonton Police Service, working alongside forensic specialists and Crown prosecutors, began the process of assembling a comprehensive case summary. This document would serve multiple purposes. It would provide transparency about the findings, support public understanding of the events, and ensure that the investigative conclusions were clearly grounded in evidence rather than speculation. One of the most important aspects of this stage was clarity. Without a trial, there would be no opportunity for competing narratives to be tested in court. There would be no defense counsel presenting alternative interpretations of evidence. As a result, investigators had an added responsibility to ensure that their conclusions were supported by multiple independent sources. Every key finding required corroboration. Physical evidence had to align with digital records. Witness statements had to be consistent with forensic results. Timeline reconstructions had to remain stable across different analytical methods. This process is what gives investigative reports their credibility in the absence of judicial proceedings. Another critical component of this phase was communication with the families of the victims. For those who lost loved ones, the legal classification of the case was less important than understanding what had happened and why. Victim services worked alongside investigators to provide updates and explanations in a controlled and sensitive manner. These communications are carefully managed. Families are typically informed before public release of final reports or major findings. The goal is to ensure that those most affected are not learning critical details through media coverage or public speculation. At the same time, investigators were aware that public interest in the case remained high. The scale of the tragedy had already placed it among the most significant homicide cases in Edmonton's modern history. As a result, there was a strong expectation for transparency. The final investigative summary needed to address not only the sequence of events, but also the broader questions raised in the aftermath. Among those questions were issues related to domestic violence intervention, firearm access, and the effectiveness of existing systems in identifying escalating risk. The report acknowledged that prior incidents involving domestic conflict had occurred over time. These incidents had been addressed through available legal and administrative mechanisms at each stage. However, the investigation also highlighted a key structural limitation: the lack of a unified system capable of integrating multiple risk indicators across different time periods and institutions. This observation did not assign fault to any single agency. Instead, it reflected a broader systemic challenge that exists in many jurisdictions. Domestic violence cases often involve fragmented information spread across police records, court proceedings, and personal reports. Without centralized risk assessment tools or coordinated intervention frameworks, it can be difficult to identify when cumulative risk reaches a critical threshold. The Edmonton case became one example frequently referenced in discussions about improving such systems. Another significant element of the final report involved the presence of a stolen firearm. The investigation confirmed that the weapon used in the incident had been reported stolen years earlier in British Columbia. While the exact path of the firearm after the theft could not be fully reconstructed, its presence in this case reinforced ongoing concerns about the circulation of illegal firearms and their role in violent crime. Law enforcement agencies often emphasize that stolen firearms represent a persistent challenge because they can remain in circulation for extended periods without detection, especially when they move across jurisdictions. The final investigative summary also addressed the suspect's background, including prior criminal history and documented interactions with the justice system. These records were included not to assign narrative meaning, but to establish factual context. Investigators were careful to avoid drawing psychological conclusions beyond what could be supported by evidence. This distinction is important in professional investigative reporting. While patterns of behavior may be identified, attributing intent or mental state without direct testimony or clinical evaluation falls outside the scope of forensic investigation. As the report neared completion, one central conclusion became clear. The events of December 29 to 30, 2014 were the result of a complex combination of personal conflict, historical interactions, and access to lethal means, rather than a single identifiable trigger. That conclusion, while factual in nature, carried significant emotional weight for the families involved. For them, the legal and investigative classifications could not fully capture the human impact of the loss. The absence of a trial also meant the absence of a formal courtroom narrative where evidence could be publicly examined and challenged. Instead, the investigative report itself became the primary record of truth. In many ways, this placed an even greater responsibility on the accuracy and integrity of the investigation. When the final report was released, it served several purposes simultaneously. It documented the factual sequence of events. It provided closure within the limits of investigative knowledge. And it contributed to ongoing public policy discussions about domestic violence prevention and firearm regulation. However, even a complete investigative report cannot answer every question in a case of this nature. There remain aspects that can only be partially understood through evidence. The internal experiences, emotions, and decision-making processes of individuals involved cannot always be fully reconstructed. What remains is a factual framework. Within that framework, investigators established what could be known with confidence, and what could only be inferred. The justice achieved in this case was therefore not delivered in a courtroom verdict, but in the preservation of an accurate historical record. A record that ensures the events are not forgotten, misrepresented, or reduced to speculation. And a record that serves, for future cases, as both documentation and cautionary example of how domestic conflict, when combined with multiple risk factors and systemic gaps, can escalate into irreversible outcomes. In the weeks and months following the December 2014 tragedy, Edmonton was left with a silence that felt different from the usual quiet of winter. It was not simply the absence of noise, but the presence of something heavier, an awareness that an ordinary residential landscape had been permanently marked by an extraordinary act of violence. Life in the affected neighborhoods eventually resumed its outward normality. Snow melted, seasons changed, and new routines slowly replaced the immediate shock of the events. Children returned to school. Commuters resumed their daily schedules. Houses that had once been surrounded by police tape became part of the everyday scenery again. But for those directly impacted, nothing truly returned to normal. Families of the victims were left to navigate a reality shaped by sudden and irreversible loss. The process involved more than grief alone. It required engagement with legal procedures, estate matters, counseling services, and the long administrative aftermath that follows any mass casualty event. Each of these steps carried its own emotional weight, often resurfacing memories that were difficult to process. In many cases, support networks became essential. Relatives, friends, and community members helped fill practical gaps in daily life. Cultural and religious communities played an important role in providing spaces for mourning and remembrance. For immigrant families in particular, these community structures often serve as both emotional and logistical support systems during times of crisis. At the broader community level, the case prompted difficult conversations about domestic violence. One of the central questions raised was how warning signs are recognized, documented, and acted upon across different systems. The investigation had shown that there were prior indicators of conflict and concern. However, those indicators had existed at different times, within different contexts, and were not always connected in a way that would have clearly signaled imminent risk. This fragmentation became a focal point in discussions among policymakers, law enforcement agencies, and social service organizations. The case highlighted a recurring challenge: domestic violence is often not a single event, but a pattern that unfolds over time. Each individual incident may appear manageable on its own, but the cumulative effect can be difficult to assess without integrated systems of communication and intervention. As a result, the Edmonton case was later referenced in broader conversations about improving risk assessment frameworks, enhancing coordination between agencies, and strengthening support mechanisms for individuals experiencing intimate partner violence. Another major area of reflection involved access to firearms. The presence of a stolen handgun in the case raised questions about how illegal firearms circulate and how they can remain undetected for years before being used in violent crime. Law enforcement agencies and policy discussions continued to emphasize the importance of tracking stolen weapons and addressing gaps that allow them to move across regions without recovery. These discussions were not unique to this case, but the scale of the tragedy gave them renewed urgency. Within the Vietnamese-Canadian community in Edmonton and beyond, the impact of the events was particularly profound. The victims were not abstract figures in news reports. They were part of interconnected families and social circles. Community members attended memorials, offered support to grieving relatives, and worked collectively to process the emotional impact of the loss. In many immigrant communities, tragedies of this scale also raise additional layers of complexity. Language barriers, cultural expectations, and differing levels of familiarity with legal and social systems can all affect how individuals access support services and engage with institutional responses. Over time, community organizations and advocacy groups continued to emphasize the importance of accessible resources for domestic violence prevention and intervention. For investigators and law enforcement professionals, the case became part of ongoing training discussions. It illustrated several key realities of domestic violence investigations: the importance of recognizing patterns of escalation, the difficulty of predicting outcomes from fragmented information, and the limitations of intervention when cases are distributed across time and systems. It also reinforced the importance of victim-centered approaches, ensuring that individuals at risk are supported through coordinated services rather than isolated responses. From a systemic perspective, the case did not lead to a single solution or simple reform. Instead, it contributed to a gradual evolution in how agencies think about risk, communication, and prevention. Changes in policy and practice in the years that followed were shaped by many cases, with this one serving as a particularly significant example due to its scale and complexity. For the city of Edmonton, the tragedy remains part of its recent history. Not as a defining characteristic, but as a reminder of the vulnerabilities that can exist behind ordinary facades. Residential neighborhoods, often associated with safety and routine, were shown to also be spaces where serious conflicts can remain hidden until they reach irreversible points. As time passes, public memory of specific details tends to fade. Dates become less precise. Names are remembered by fewer people. Media coverage moves on to new events. But for those whose lives were directly affected, the impact does not fade in the same way. It becomes part of personal history, something carried forward, even as life continues in new directions. The final reflection of this case is not found in the actions of one individual or the conclusions of an investigation. It is found in the broader questions it leaves behind. How can systems better identify escalating risk in domestic violence cases? How can fragmented information be connected in time to prevent future tragedies? How can support for vulnerable individuals be made more accessible before crises occur? These questions do not have simple answers. They require ongoing attention, collaboration, and a willingness to learn from difficult cases. The Edmonton family tragedy remains one of those cases. Not because it can be fully explained, but because it continues to inform how communities, institutions, and individuals think about prevention, responsibility, and care. And in that sense, the most important outcome of the investigation is not closure in the traditional sense. It is awareness. A recognition that violence of this scale rarely begins with a single moment, but develops over time in spaces that are often difficult to see until it is too late. Time moves forward in a city the same way it does everywhere else, quietly, without permission, and without pause. In Edmonton, seasons changed after December 2014 just as they always had. Snow gave way to spring melt, then summer heat, and eventually another winter returned to cover the streets again. But for those connected to the events of that December night, time did not move in the same way. There are moments in any community that become reference points. People remember where they were when they heard the news, who they called first, and how long it took for the reality to settle in. Over time, those memories do not disappear, but they change shape. They become less immediate, less sharp, but never fully distant. The official investigation concluded what it could conclude. The timeline was reconstructed. The sequence of events was documented. The identity of the person responsible was established through evidence and confirmed through forensic analysis. The file was closed in an investigative sense, even if it could never feel emotionally complete. Because some cases do not end with answers that feel like closure. Instead, they end with documentation. A record of what happened, and how it happened, as precisely as it could be preserved. For the families, the loss remains personal in a way no report can fully describe. For investigators, the case becomes part of professional memory, one of many files that demonstrate both the strengths and limits of modern investigative work. For the wider public, it becomes another reminder that domestic violence is not always visible until it reaches its most irreversible form. Over time, attention moves elsewhere. New cases emerge. New names enter public awareness. But the underlying questions remain unchanged. How many warning signs are missed because they are separated by time, systems, or silence? How many interventions arrive too late because risk is only understood in hindsight? And how many tragedies never become public at all, existing instead in quieter forms that never reach headlines? These are not questions with fixed answers. They are ongoing responsibilities. What remains from this case is not only the record of what occurred, but the awareness it leaves behind. An awareness that safety is often assumed in places where conflict is hidden, and that the most serious risks are sometimes the ones that develop slowly, over years, behind ordinary doors. And perhaps that is the only form of closure some cases can offer. Not resolution, but recognition. That understanding is where the story ends and where its lessons continue. Edmonton is a city built on distance. Wide roads. Suburban neighborhoods stretching outward. Houses that look similar from the outside but contain entirely different lives within. In neighborhoods like Clavatin and Haddow, life in 2014 followed a familiar rhythm. People went to work, came home, visited relatives, and marked time through seasons rather than events. Winter was not unusual, it was expected. Snow, ice, and silence were part of the landscape. Within that environment lived a Vietnamese-Canadian family network, like many immigrant families who had built new lives in Canada over decades. Work was central. Family ties were strong. Relationships often extended beyond nuclear households into wider circles of relatives and close friends. From the outside, nothing about these families would have suggested an approaching crisis. But domestic violence rarely presents itself in ways that are visible to outsiders. It develops in private spaces, through patterns, through cycles, and through moments that are often dismissed as temporary conflict rather than warning signs. The center of this case was a complex family structure shaped by migration, relationships, separation, and ongoing interpersonal conflict. Former relationships had not fully disengaged from one another. Financial pressure, emotional strain, and personal disputes created an environment where tensions could resurface over time rather than disappear completely. Investigators later noted that there had been prior police involvement related to domestic disputes. There were also documented allegations of threats and conflict that had been addressed through the legal system at earlier points in time. None of these incidents, viewed individually, explained what would eventually happen. But collectively, they formed part of a broader context that investigators would later analyze as an escalating pattern. Domestic violence experts often emphasize that risk is not defined by a single event. It is defined by repetition. And escalation. On December 29, 2014, what began as an ordinary winter evening gradually transitioned into a sequence of emergency calls that would spread across multiple locations in Edmonton and beyond. Police were initially responding to what appeared to be isolated incidents. But as officers arrived at different scenes, a pattern began to emerge. Multiple locations were connected. Multiple victims were involved. And the situation was no longer contained within a single household. Investigators later reconstructed a timeline showing movement between residential areas in north and southwest Edmonton, followed by a final location outside the city in Fort Saskatchewan. By the time the full scope became clear, the case had already become one of the most serious homicide investigations in Edmonton's modern history. In the early stages of the investigation, the focus was not on understanding motive, but on confirming facts. Forensic teams documented multiple scenes. Ballistic analysis linked evidence across locations. Digital records helped establish movement patterns. And witness statements provided supporting context. One of the first major conclusions was that the incidents were connected and not random. The second was that the suspect was known to the victims. This immediately shifted the nature of the investigation from unknown offender tracking to a domestic-linked case. Investigators began reviewing prior records involving domestic conflict, including police interactions and court-related documentation. What emerged was not a single defining cause, but a history of repeated interpersonal strain. As the investigation deepened, one of the most difficult questions emerged. Could this have been prevented? There was no single answer. There were prior incidents, but they were separated across time. There were warning signs, but they were not always connected within a unified system. There were interventions, but they were episodic rather than continuous. This fragmentation is one of the central challenges in domestic violence prevention systems globally. Risk is often visible only in hindsight. When individual events are reviewed together after a tragedy, patterns become clearer. But at the time they occur, they are often treated as separate cases. Another critical element in the investigation was the presence of a firearm used in the incidents. It was later identified as a stolen handgun, originally reported missing years earlier in British Columbia. This discovery raised broader questions about how illegal firearms remain in circulation and how they intersect with domestic violence cases. Firearms do not create conflict, but they can determine its outcome. In investigative analysis, access to lethal means is considered one of the most significant risk factors in domestic homicide cases. As forensic and digital evidence was compiled, investigators gradually constructed a coherent timeline of events across multiple locations. Surveillance data, phone records, and physical evidence allowed them to verify movement and sequence. At this stage, the investigation shifted from active uncertainty to structured reconstruction. The goal was no longer to identify what happened. It was to document it with precision. Because in cases where there is no trial, the investigative file becomes the only formal record of truth. With the death of the individual identified as responsible, the case did not proceed through the traditional court system. There was no prosecution, no verdict, no cross-examination. Instead, the responsibility for establishing factual certainty rested entirely on the investigative report. This placed additional pressure on law enforcement to ensure that every conclusion was supported by multiple forms of evidence. For families of victims, this also meant that closure would not come through courtroom proceedings, but through documentation and explanation. In the aftermath, Edmonton returned to its normal rhythm. But for those directly affected, life continued in a fundamentally different way. Families navigated grief, legal processes, and long-term emotional consequences. Community members processed the event collectively, particularly within interconnected social and cultural networks. The case also became part of broader discussions about domestic violence prevention, risk assessment, and the need for improved coordination between systems. It highlighted a recurring reality. Domestic violence is rarely a single incident. It is often a trajectory. The official investigation closed its file with a structured narrative of events, evidence, and conclusions. But some aspects of the case remain outside the reach of documentation. Not because they are unknown, but because they exist in the space between data and human experience. What remains is not only a record of what happened, but a set of questions that continue to matter. How can systems better recognize escalation earlier? How can fragmented information be connected before it becomes irreversible? And how can prevention move closer to the moment where intervention still matters? This case does not offer a simple answer. But it does offer a warning. That violence rarely begins at its final stage. It builds. Quietly. Over time. Until one day, it no longer stays hidden.